The most elaborate cat video distribution system ever built was designed to coordinate military response after nuclear annihilation. That is the story most people believe. The decentralized architecture that makes the internet resilient was supposedly engineered to survive the end of the world. That story is almost true. The gap between intention and outcome is where the real story lives. A young engineer at RAND was asked whether the United States could command its nuclear forces after a Soviet first strike. He concluded no. The American military telephone system ran through a handful of switching stations. Knock those out and the country goes blind. So he designed a network that could not be knocked out. 11 volumes of mathematics, published in 1964. Every signal broken into small pieces. Every piece routed through redundant nodes. No central authority. No single point of failure. A system built to keep working after the bombs fell. The network that became the internet was supposed to coordinate military response after nuclear annihilation. Have you ever used the internet without thinking about why it stays up? Stick around. The answer is stranger than the myth. His name was Paul Baran. He arrived at RAND in 1959, a Polish-American engineer with a gift for finding the weak point in a system. By 1960, he had identified American strategic communications as exactly that. The US command system depended on the AT&T long lines network, with long-distance calls routed through a small number of major switching centers. Every call passed through a physical switchboard, the same basic design used since the 1880s. A handful of Soviet warheads could leave the country full of generals with no way to talk to each other. Baran wrote that communications was the Achilles heel of American defense. Between 1960 and 1964, he designed a network that could lose half its nodes and still function. Messages would be chopped into uniform blocks, each carrying its destination address. Each block would hop independently from node to node, finding whatever route was open. There was no master switch, no central brain. The network was the network. The full design filled 11 volumes. RAND published them in 1964 as On Distributed Communications. Funding came from the US Air Force. There was only one problem. To build the thing, the Air Force would need AT&T's transmission lines, and AT&T refused. Baran described the dispute in a 2009 talk at RAND as a religious difference. AT&T's objections: the existing system was not really vulnerable. Packet routing would not work. Any new system had to be backward compatible. The physical routes did not exist, and the company would not be asked to create a competitor to itself. The military network for nuclear survival was never built. The volumes sat on a shelf. 3,000 miles away, a British computer scientist at the National Physical Laboratory arrived at almost exactly the same architecture. He had no access to Baran's classified RAND work. He simply faced the same problem and solved it the same way. His name was Donald Watts Davies. In a 1966 paper, he introduced two ideas the world now considers obvious. The first was a short term for the chunks Baran had called message blocks. Davies called them packets. The word stuck. The second was a small interface computer between the user and the network. Davies also built the Mark I at NPL, which began operating in 1969. Elements of it running earlier in the year than ARPANET's first message, though the network was not fully operational until 1970. So by the late 1960s, two parallel discoveries had produced the same answer. A network with no central node, routing small units of data through redundant paths, would survive the loss of most of itself. Both men imagined it for war. Both were about to be upstaged by someone who had imagined it for something else. In 1962, a psychologist named J.C.R. Licklider was appointed to lead a new office inside ARPA. In a series of memos, he described his goal as an intergalactic computer network, an electronic commons open to all. the main medium of informational interaction for governments, institutions, corporations, and individuals. The very first articulation of what became the Internet as a global civilian project was already global, and it was already civilian. The official story goes like this. ARPANET inherited Baran's design, was built by the Pentagon, and became the Internet. That is partially true, and partially is the wrong amount for understanding what really happened. In 1968, ARPA issued a request for proposals to build a packet-switched network. The document named its purpose in plain language: resource sharing between research universities, not nuclear survivability, not military communications. The ability of academic computer scientists to log into each other's expensive mainframes without driving across the country. The man who wrote the program plan was Lawrence Roberts, a young MIT engineer who had worked with Licklider at ARPA. The plan was titled Resource Sharing Computer Networks, approved on June 21, 1968. The contract went to a Cambridge firm called BBN, which built the interface message processors. Each cost roughly $82,200 and ran on Honeywell DDP-5 hardware. The first 4 nodes were scheduled to be UCLA, the Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. The first ARPANET message went out at 10:30 p.m. on October 29, 1969. A graduate student named Charlie Klein typed from a UCLA terminal toward a computer at the Stanford Research Institute. The intended word was login. Only the letters L and O made it through. The full episode lasted about an hour. Nobody mentioned a nuclear war. Janet Abate, whose 1999 MIT Press history, Inventing the Internet Remains the Standard Academic Account, found no nuclear survivability language in the program's founding documents. The historians Katie Hafner and Matthew Lyon trace the same shift toward civilian purpose in Where Wizards Stay Up Late. The nuclear story was not in the primary record. By the early 1970s, ARPANET had a problem. It worked. It connected 4 universities, and almost nobody had a use for it. The breakthrough came from a BBN engineer named Ray Tomlinson, and it had nothing to do with the Pentagon. In 1971, Tomlinson glued together 2 programs that already existed on the network's host computers: an in-house messaging system called SNDMSG and a file transfer utility called CPYNet. The result was the first network email. He chose the Ulrich sign because it was an obscure key on his teletype. The first test message went to himself. The content was, by his own recollection, something like QWERTY. Email was not on any ARPA planning document. It was a side project. Within 2 years, it accounted for most of the traffic on the network. The first internet had its first killer app, and it was civilian. Meanwhile, the actual military had quietly walked away. In 1983, the Pentagon spun off its own dedicated defense network called MILNET. The Army, the Navy, and the Air Force used MILNET for operational communications and left ARPANET behind. The National Science Foundation stepped in with NSFNet in 1986, a civilian research network built to link its supercomputer centers and the broader academic community. The architecture of war had become the infrastructure of academia. In 1990, the original ARPANET was formally decommissioned. No Soviet attack had ever come. The Cold War ended without the network ever firing a packet in self-defense. By the time it shut down, the first internet was already overwhelmingly civilian. The military had built its own smaller, separate network. And the killer app was email. The narrative took on a life of its own. Every history of the internet repeats the line. Textbooks repeat it. Documentaries repeat it. The Pentagon is happy to repeat it because war stories fund programs. But the primary documents do not support the popular version. And the deeper irony, the one the standard retelling never quite catches, belongs to a phone company. AT&T had refused to build Baran's distributed network because it would have meant dismantling its own business. Long-distance calls occupied a dedicated circuit for their full duration, and AT&T's revenue model depended on charging for that occupied time. Packet switching was an existential threat, so the company refused to build it. Decades later, the technology AT&T had refused to build dismantled it anyway. The internet that emerged from NSFNet ran over phone lines AT&T still owned in packets. AT&T Corp was forced to divest its regional Bell companies in 1984. The company that remained was eventually acquired by SBC Communications in 2005, which took the AT&T name. The architecture AT&T had refused to build reshaped and ultimately undermined its empire. Baran himself had seen part of it coming. In 1967, he wrote about online shopping, online banking, and a home information utility where every household could check its bank balance from a console in the living room. He was not designing a war machine. He was designing a world. Paul Baran died in 2011, 4 years into the smartphone era and half a century into distributed communications. It is impossible to say with certainty what he would have made of the world his architecture helped build. The man who wrote 11 volumes on distributed communications lived long enough to see the same design carry billions of people shopping, watching, arguing, falling in love, to see packet switching become, of all things, the technical foundation of cat videos. The Pentagon paid for the design. AT&T refused to build it. A psychologist named Licklider had imagined something global and civilian all along. A graduate student at UCLA typed the letters L and O. An engineer at BBN invented email because nobody told him not to. The architecture of war became the architecture of everything else. That is the real origin of the internet. And it is stranger, more ironic, and more human than the version most people were told. What surprised you most about the gap between the myth and the record? Tell us in the comments. And if you enjoy uncovering the real origins behind familiar things, leave a like and subscribe to The Origin Point.